I feel dangerous. Like there's these JS wars, right? And I feel like I'm stepping into one right now, but I'll give my view. We'll see what happens.
Hello and welcome to episode 17 of React Native Radio. Today on our show, we have Jed Watson.
Hi, everyone.
Peter Pikarczyk.
Hey, everyone.
Kevin Old.
Hello.
And I'm Nader Dabbit. Today, our special guest is Brian Leonard. Brian's the chief architect and also the technical co-founder of TaskRabbit. Brian, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself and kind of give us a quick background of what you do and how you got there, I guess?
Sure. Thanks, Nader. My name is Brian Leonard. I work at TaskRabbit. TaskRabbit's an app and a website to get stuff done, normal, everyday stuff. Go to IKEA, bring it back, put it together, that sort of thing. We've been doing it for a while. Started in 2008. Before that, I worked at IBM, hailing from Texas originally, and just love making software that makes people's lives easier.
Awesome. So I see that you're the technical co-founder, but you're also the chief architect. So did you get into software development? Did you go to school for it, or is it something that you kind of picked up in some other way?
Yeah, I got a computer engineering degree from Clemson University in South Carolina. Did several internships around the country, eventually ending up at IBM in Boston. Worked there for a while, and the founder of TaskRabbit is named Leah, and I worked with her at IBM, and she had this idea and, really got it all going.
Okay, cool. So we'll go ahead and jump into React Native, I guess. So what are you guys doing with React Native right now?
Oh, we love React Native, that's for sure. I just think every now and then something comes along and you can just see that it's the future and the way that you should be building. And I really think that's true with these apps. We have four, I suppose. TaskRabbit has 4 apps, one for each platform, iOS and Android, but also one for the clients, the people that, need help, and one for the taskers, the people doing the work. And so we saw a really good opportunity based on inefficiency. The React Native promised that we'd be able to build it once, more or less, and, deploy to both. And we were just building everything, say, for the tasker side twice. And it was worth exploring this new technology in that environment because it was, it wasn't the public app. And if there were any major issues, it's also how they make money. So they were, a little bit more willing to put up with any UI things if it wasn't quite there. Since diving in, it's all there as far as I can tell. And, we've released an app on iOS and are now working on the Android version.
So out of curiosity, is that your first intro to React, or did you use React on the web beforehand?
Yeah, it's a great question. We're currently, because of React Native, actually starting to use React on our website. When we were picking our framework on the web a while back, React was just one of many other words that I didn't have time to research. But when I saw how much, love it was getting in the community, and then especially with the release of React Native, I started learning first web and then native, and just, fell in love with that development cycle, particularly on iOS.
Yeah, it's pretty compelling. Were you working with any other, let's call them non-native technologies? Did you have any hybrid apps beforehand? Or was it just a jump from native development to React Native for you on the mobile side?
That was the most recent jump. We had all of our apps were written purely in Objective-C or Android. There were a few web views in specific spots. I think web views are a pretty good idea, where it's the whole component you're interacting with, and maybe only read only or something like that. Or when you tap on it, you tap on the whole thing. I think coming from a very early on I just lost the name of it. You were just talking about it, Jed. What's the name? PhoneGap.
Cordova, PhoneGap.
Yeah, we had a PhoneGap app that more or less it was trendy in 2009 to when you're looking at it from an iPhone, make the header blue and the background all iPhone looky. And we had a PhoneGap one that wrapped that at the time, and certainly got us a presence in the App Store, which was good. But there's that uncanny gap between tapping on all those buttons and things like that. That I think it's really great if you can get a native thing in there to get that experience. And React is sort of a really interesting compromise between the two.
Yeah, it doesn't fall into the uncanny valley of hybrid apps very easily, that's for sure, which is really nice. What is it about, I mean, you mentioned that you like React, you sort of heard about it and everyone sort of gave it good reviews and then you started using it. What are the things that stand out for you out of curiosity about React itself as opposed to just a way of writing, mobile apps using JavaScript and more web-like technologies like the live reloading and things?
Yeah, I feel dangerous. Like there's JS wars, right? And I feel like I'm stepping into one right now, but I'll give my view. We'll see what happens.
Sorry about that.
I think in the not quite the beginning, but in the beginning of the modern era, there was jQuery, and we use a Rails app, and you use Rails to put something down on the page, and then you hook something. You hook like a little arrow, and then when they click on it, you show some element, or you hide something, or move something around, and all that. And that was really awesome at the time, obviously. And since then, the very highest level, couching my JS words here, at the very highest level, I think we haven't advanced that much further, frankly. Like, you still put things down on the DOM, and then you're reacting to changes in the data when you're using something like Ember or whatever it is, Angular. And you're thinking in delta between where the page is right now and where the DOM is right now. And like, oh, this event happened, so change it in this way. And at the same time, apps have got much more complicated. We have single page app, like several single page apps sort of like in one site, like a whole account section is one app, and our whole task posting flow is one app. And this is way past where we were with jQuery, right? Like, we're 40 clicks in, and you have to understand all the possible state transitions. And it's just so hard to have that all in your mind. And I see React as just a straight up tier level step, because it's closer to what we're really good at. Very similar to Rails, in fact. You take your state, or state and props, I guess, in this case, and you just render what the user should see given that state. And I find that just an exceptionally powerful and liberating change in metaphor, made possible by the DOM diffing and other things like that they've done.
I think that's the first time I've ever heard React likened to Rails before.
Yeah.
I was going to say
we could go all the way back to PHP, right? Like, at some point it was super liberating to like write that HTML, and that little question mark or whatever it was all up in the middle of the thing. You just understood what you were outputting.
That's a really, really good point. And it's so, for context, right? I just got back from presenting React to a room full of developers at PhoneGap Day in Utah. And that's kind of an interesting pitch, because normally when you're dealing with React and mobile dev, you're dealing with React Native. Whereas I was sort of, selling this room full of people on the concept of trying React in PhoneGap. And I was in a room full of people who were very much Angular devs. And back to the whole JS Wars thing, sorry for dragging you into that, but the reason I was asking is because they ran a poll which asked the room, and I guess the broader community on the internet, what is your favorite framework for developing hybrid mobile apps? And the four choices would have been React, Angular, jQuery, and other comment, but most people said Ember. And React lost, like, terribly. Even jQuery beat React for hybrid developers. And I thought that was hopefully not a reflection of my talk, because this was just after my talk had finished. And also, really interesting to see how I was pitching basically what you just said, which is that it's almost like server-side rendering on the client, where we used to live in this world where it was really easy. We'd load up all our state, we'd generate the interface, that would get sent down the wire, and then it would get rendered by the browser. And this is like the same cycle happening, only we're loading our state either by manipulating internally or from an API, and then describing what it should look like, and then that the rendering of that's being taken care of us by React instead of, the browser parsing an entire HTML page. So like on one hand, it's really cool to hear that was the thing that you went to about why React's fun to work with. But I was also, I guess, interested in, obviously you guys have gone all in on React, which is great on a React podcast, but is that also something that you've found coming from native development, that it also changes? So it's not just the change in the way you used to work with jQuery and other frameworks, but is it a similar change for native development that you found?
It's interesting. The big leap forward there, I think, isn't as much in mindset. I guess I could talk about that in a second. I think the big leap forward on native is the dev cycle and the seeing your change immediately and things like that. The Command R being brought to the iPhone simulator. There's just a big difference. I've done iOS development as well, and you've got this UI that you want to build, and you want to change the background to red, and you want to move something down a little bit, and you want to round the corners, whatever it is. Before, because of the compile time involved, you'd sort of do all of that once and see how it came out. And, with the Command R and React Native, you sort of do those each at one time, which it's hard to quantify, but I believe adds a whole level of quality when you iterate to that spot instead of trying to do it in one big step, because it takes that whole, it sounds absurd saying it takes a whole minute to reload, but as I'm sure you guys know, that stuff adds up during the dev cycle. As far as the actual model goes, at least how I've built iOS apps, I'd say it's actually closer to what I just said, because it's closer to how we're using React, which is to say taking the whole state and rendering it to the screen. I think iOS has always had all of its data locally, and and there's not as much information on the page. So more or less how I've built iOS apps over the last several years is approximately taking a database, state, so to speak, and rendering it to the screen. And even the, Ajax, so to speak, calls that I make are really to fill in the database and then tell it the screen to re-render from the database, more or less. And so I'd say the way I've been building iOS apps is actually closer to the React model, which is maybe one of the reasons I like it. We found that those kinds of iOS apps in any technology are much more resistant to, people going taskers in subways, for example, and, it's always available offline and things like that.
So that's an interesting little segue there. What are you using to manage the state in your React Native apps? So you're using a framework like Flux or Redux, or have you come up with a database-driven way of doing it that's more similar to what you just talked about from the history in iOS?
Yeah, we first of all, we have a Flux architecture. And so from our blog, tech.taskrabbit.com, there's several articles on React. And one of those is they all actually point to our sample application. So it has a good example of how we are doing Flux, but no particular library other than I think we use a dispatcher. So we have actions and dispatchers and stores and that kind of stuff. And so there's several types of stores, which is kind of what you're asking about. And some of them are what I would call singletons. Who's currently logged in? We have a current user store. We have a profile store, things like that. And they're singletons. On those, we're storing to the file system using the one built into React Native. It's something like local storage or async local storage or something like that. And, that ends up writing stuff. We choose to write JSON. I think that's probably the most common pattern to the local file system in iOS and Android. And so when the app boots up, we'll sort of reload it from there. For other things, specifically in our world, we have a chat client. We have, all the tasks that the tasker is working on and, and have worked on, like their transaction history. We're using a store in the same way, and what we're using is a Realm database. which is a cross-platform, database library. They probably wouldn't want me to say it, but not unlike SQLite or Core Data or something like that. We're working with them directly in a beta, and they're going to eventually release that to the more greater public, I believe. So high level, most of these React stores have like immutable JS or just some like global singleton, like say array up at the top of the file. And instead of having one of those, we read and write synchronously to a database that can have, thousands of items, thousands of chat messages and that sort of stuff with a specific query.
Hey, so when you first got started with React Native, what did your iOS and Android developers first think about it? Were they like excited or, a little hesitant? What was that like for you, especially at a company where opinions like that may matter, and someone can, or like a group of people can decide not to incorporate it,
Yeah.
What was like the culture aspect of that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I proposed a talk for React Conf that I thought would actually be interesting, which is like evangelizing React Native within your organization or something like that. And it's certainly challenges there, right? Like, I'm an iOS developer and I've just mastered this situation, right? Like I'm just making just buttery smooth apps, right? And now you're coming along telling me like, let's write in JS and it's going to do some crazy thing. And like, I'm super skeptical. And like, I've just spent the last 10 years, like mastering this thing. So that's certainly a challenge. And I think one thing there is it's got to be like just the work also on Android is a big deal. So there's some companies writing everything in like pure C so that it can run on both. And I would say React Native is a much better way to do that. And so the track to get started there might be just taking one section of the current app, and incorporating this. In this specific case for us, like I said, we have all the apps and there's currently no plans to rewrite our, App Store app. It would certainly take a long time and the experience is great and that team's doing a great job. We decided to rewrite the more internal facing app, internal being the 30,000 taskers we have, but that's still nothing compared to the millions of, consumers. And to do that, the team lead actually wasn't a mobile developer at all. JR is on our team and he's a web developer historically in Ruby and, just took over this project and fell in love with the technology. And we booted up the whole app, sort of with this foundation being the JS as opposed to sort of the JS plugging into a more Objective-C thing.
Cool.
So you mentioned Android in there and, being able to build something and have it work across both platforms.
Yeah.
How's that going for you?
It's going super well. I think it's promising, right? Like, so we took a step into this world before we were there. At one point there was like some web page and they said that like Facebook View said like, it'll be about 6 months. And then some enterprising young soul put up a countdown timer, right? That really kept them their feet to the fire, I'm sure. So like when we started iOS, we're hoping that the Android would come along and we were just getting a head start on it. And thankfully it did. And, frankly, it's still catching up. Talked to a few people at Facebook, particularly a guy named Martin there that's working on doing just an amazing job on getting things ported over. And, there's still some work to go and there's some components that we wrote in iOS. We recently published a blog post sort of with a progress report on that. And it's the things you can share almost everything. So the interesting things to talk about are the things you can't share. Because you can share all of especially the business logic, I think is just something people completely underestimate. We talk about, these apps are closer to the UI than web apps in my experience, right? Like you talk about front end and back end in web apps and, you don't hear that as much when you're talking native development. But the specific logic of when somebody hits a button on our app and like two people hit it at the same time, and like what are the rules about who's allowed to do that task and all these other things that we have, that's really important to have a level playing field in a marketplace like ours. And it's really awesome that we can write that in pure JS and it'd be constant across all the apps. But the things that are different are obviously the sort of environment and how it's booting up, and native things. The back button on Android is certainly different than the paradigms on iOS, as well as how they deal with forms and things like that. Also some native libraries, Facebook login and things like that use the bridge. Other than that, just the slightly different paradigms of how the users expect those apps to work. One example is I actually rewrote in JS this segment control. They provide something like segment control iOS, but it's not really that hard to make it look right just in, pure JS land. But then it turns out, Android has completely different ways they'd want to do a control like that. And so we're in the process now of deciding which of those we think are a good idea and which of those, are sort of arbitrary choices, and we might as well share the code. We're probably going to end up sharing about definitely 80+% of their overall code, maybe 90.
That's a great number. I think that point about sharing logic between platforms is a really strong one. I mean, if we're talking about React being, the modern version of server-side rendering in the client, then really what you've got controlling the stores and the pieces that talk to your API and perform the business logic, that's effectively your new back-end code for the app. And then your API is more like your data store with some business logic, which back in the day might have even been a stored procedure in a database. So we're kind of moving all this stuff to the front, and it's a really good point. Something we're doing on a couple of projects is actually even sharing the same kind of logic where we're writing a React Native app and a web app. And of course, these want to be in separate repositories and they want to be their own, complete project structure. But we're using NPM private modules to share a whole lot of code between the web React and the React Native.
Yeah.
Which is even before you get to, maybe one day with React Native for web, just kind of bringing it all around again full circle. Before you get to, any kind of crazy sharing that you could do with that, it's a huge benefit, I think, to be able to share that kind of code across platforms.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
What's bitten you?
What's bitten us? The JS versions are different between various iOSs and probably Androids too. Some certainly to be on the lookout for. Right before we're about to release, it's not just your libraries, like it's the libraries that you may depend on, right? And somebody was using Symbol, the sort of ES 2015 probably, one of the newer things. And we didn't have the right Babel, polyfill, something or another, all this JS stuff, that we tried it like right at the last second before releasing, and like realized that it straight up crashed when launched on iOS 8, I think it was, or 7, or whatever we were trying to launch on, the lower end. And it's certainly something to just because the JS feels like it's run everywhere. I think there's still phone to phone, especially in Android and in iOS, incompatibilities and testing you have to do. And so, one of the things I'm really excited about is our test suite. And we have an integration test suite running on, sort of a matrix of phones and iOSs and things like that, and making sure that, it's staying working across the board like we think it is.
That is cool. Can you tell us more about your test suite?
Sure. There's a blog post on that as well. It's called React Native Integration Testing, and it's there's several kinds of testing you might consider doing with any React project or any project at all, but especially a React project. We have some unit tests which are testing like our routing library, or maybe some pure JS thing like date parsing or something like that. You might have component tests that test not a whole screen, but like, one row of some table, and given X props and Y state, what does it do? And then the third level is integration testing, which is basically mashing on the phone or simulator just like a user would and checking to make sure that the right stuff comes out. And so mostly we've done the last one because that's just closest if you're only going to do one, I highly recommend doing that one. The only issue is that it's slow, but we say that slow tests are better than no tests. So you kick this thing off and it takes on your own machine, it takes 4 hours to build. Now, fortunately, we've parallelized it a lot. The sample app has it as well, but super long story short, because I have talks just on this, it boots up Mocha, and Node.js is kind of awesome. So it boots up the packager, the React Native packager. It boots up this thing called Appium, which launches the simulator, and it boots up a web browser. A fake web server. It's a Koa server, which is similar to Express. And each test can be like, hey, server, stub out this response, and then it'll open up in the simulator and you say, click this, click that, click this, click that, make sure that the page has this, make sure the page has that. And it just sort of robots up the simulator. One really interesting thing we found is with a Flux architecture, instead of clicking to log in and a variety of other things that you do very commonly, you can actually dispatch the events that you would have got through real stuff, but you can dispatch the events directly to log in, which makes the test a lot faster. We also have this thing in our sample app also that's every page is URL addressable, every screen. So, most iOS apps have a navigation stack, right? And you're looking at some list of posts, and then, you click on one of those and you see one of the posts. I don't know, it's an example. And so that thing would have a URL /posts/19. So something else cool that's going on in the test is instead of navigating through the whole app to get to something that's 7 layers deep, you can sort of launch that URL directly to that thing and sort of fiddle around with it directly. It's kind of cool.
Yeah. Hey, can you talk a little bit about the routing layer that you have? I seem to recall a post where it may have been before React Router was solid. Did you guys write your own version of a router?
Yeah. Does React Router, now that React is sort of on the same branch, does React Router work on native now? Is that the story?
I'm not sure. Someone else might know. I've not used it. I've not used React Router on React Native or even attempted.
I don't think it does. Just because the paradigms are a little different, right? I guess you have these nested structures, but then kind of popping and pushing stuff to a stack would throw a lot of people off. Just thinking about, I have no idea what the actual answer is. I'm just thinking aloud.
I know
we looked briefly into that, and it sort of feels right. But the stack notion and we actually had recursive use cases, which I couldn't figure out how to represent in React Router. So you can imagine if your whole navigation stack, so we worked as hard as we could to make it actually just like regular URLs. And you can imagine if you had a URL that represented your complete navigation stack at any given time, and those pages, those screens sort of link to each other, you actually have recursive routing. So if someone is looking at their list of tasks and then clicks on a task and then clicks on this little calendar icon up at the top, which lists their tasks, which shows a task, and it's sort of back upon itself. I actually didn't find any routing libraries that thought recursion was a use case. So we ended up writing our own. And it's right down to the metal, right? So we don't have a DSL or anything like that, but you could imagine splitting a string by slashes and then sort of, okay, list the first section is list, and like parse that, and then that object that returns know how to parse its children and things like that. And if it's something it hasn't heard of, return the equivalent of 404. But every screen in our app has a URL, which is turned out to be just super, super valuable in the testing, as I mentioned before. And also, I've really struggled in other native apps to sort of backfill in deep links. And it's really hard, really, because you got to push the whole stack to the right spot. And a lot of times you'll see a list first, and that'll assume some API happened, obviously. But then if you tap on it, it'll assume the data is already there. And so you can't go directly to the deeper one because like the real fetching happened in the list or something like that. And so one thing that's important about making everything URL addressable is that each page has to bootstrap itself, at least be able to bootstrap itself, only from information in the URL, say ID or something like that. And so we basically build up that route stack from the URL and push it onto the navigation controller. One thing that I think was super novel is that we hook into like should component update or something like that. And if our state is changing and it's only one level up or down that stack from where we currently are, we do a push or a pop. And so it looks like a navigation, but it's really pushing the whole stack again. And so you can always just out of nowhere, just launch a new URL to go to exactly the right spot. I do know that there's a library kind of like that. We never made it into a library. The guys over at Exponent released a library that looks very similar to that, and I've been considering checking out to see if it's would work for us, because I'm all for getting on community best practices when they exist. They just not exist at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to go back to something that we were talking about earlier, in that you said that you guys released the Tasker app. Those are in React Native. Right. Can you talk about the transition between those being native apps, and then how you transition those into React Native apps?
Sure. So I was the initial prototyper of the app, and which is what you get to do when you're chief architect, right? Like the first 80% is super fun. And so then I handed it off and became sort of the PM of that project. And it was certainly the best project I've ever worked with, especially as a PM, because usually you're making decisions. And I made the explicit goal and, at the very beginning that there would be no decisions, because we had a perfect spec of what this app should do. And so, the engineer would come and say, "Hey, Brian, what do you think when I tap on this? What should it pop up? Should it do this?" And I said, "Well, what does the spec say?" And the spec is the app that taskers are already using. It's perfect. Like it was pixel by pixel. So our goal was just to actually reproduce that app exactly as much as possible, within reason of engineering. If it was going to take, there was a non-critical thing and it would have taken days longer or something like that. We didn't do it, but like, I think we almost nailed it, other than better font scaling. We have better font scaling in the new app. And so we deploy to their taskers via Hockey App Enterprise distribution. It's not in the App Store. And so we uploaded the new app. We had betas with some of the taskers too, just to make sure that it withstood their use. But when we were ready to go, we uploaded the new app, and it has to have the same bundle ID. We're finding in Android actually that it works best if it even has the same package names and folder structures as the original one. And we uploaded with the same bundle ID, and they just got a new release like any other one that we've released over the last couple of years, right? And the most beautiful thing that happened was that nobody said anything. It was just they're not
They
even
just
sure
thought it was like the same app.
Yeah, like I can't find, like, what do you think of the new app? And they said, "Did you do something with the font?"
Yeah, no one said, "Hey,
so
I
cool.
looked at font smoothing."
Yeah, they sure,
on scaling.
It's a successful project when they don't even know, right? It's not like any of them said, like, it feels like you're using a single-threaded back-end runtime to... No, it's nothing. It was just a new app. And that was, music to my ears, not saying a darn thing.
Well, considering that you built the app twice, pretty much, you built it natively and then with React Native, I'm curious to know, like, how the productivity was versus the first and the second build.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly hard to quantify. That app was 2 years old or so, and it had been iterated over, as we learned in the marketplace and all sorts of other stuff, right? And so, like, we didn't build it from scratch to its current state. It definitely has significantly less lines of code now, and we built it in, I don't know, 2 months full time. There's some stats there's a blog post called React Native Launch. There's a whole bunch of stats there about the number of screens we have and the number of lines and how much is JS and how much is Objective-C and that sort of stuff. We're really trying to, take the opportunity to document a lot of these things for the community, because there was nothing when we searched, that's for sure. And so, there's an opportunity when these new technologies come out to sort of lead the way, and that's really fun.
Just to flesh out that stat, do you mind telling us how many engineers there were over the 2 months? How many people was that?
1 full time.
Oh, wow. Very nice.
It's a good stat.
So I prototyped it. I sort of got, it's sort of my job to make sure that, like, we wouldn't get 90% done with this thing, and then on our last item, right, like, oh my gosh, we can't send push notifications or something disastrous like that, right? And so I had this checklist that I worked on, over probably a month, just in my spare time. I try to work on things that are longer range like that, that's not blocking the team. And, sort of got a placeholder for all the screens, but they were all just basically the welcome screen from the React Native app, sample app, or the one that ships when you do the, generator. And, sort of made sure that we could do a lot of the things that I thought might be hard, and then handed it over to this engineer we have, JR. He's written a few blog posts too. And dude just killed it. I mean, I can't over express how effective he was in this environment. And then right around the last week, we hired another engineer, and so now both of them are working on the Android app.
Do you find that it's any different having a group of people work together? Like, is it easier, harder, or just no change between having a team of multiple people working on a native app versus having a team of people working on a React native app?
I certainly, the process certainly seems, I think, much bigger. I think just in its natural minimal state, a web project, at least a Ruby and Node projects that I've done, sustain larger teams than native projects in the whole. And there's just crazy stuff that I know some people have worked around, even just the Xcode build environment situation. I've seen get kind of crazy with a team of more than 5. There's always someone fighting over some file that gets checked in, and the whole thing gets borked sometimes. I think a little of that applies to React Native, but some of those build processes are still in place. I did notice the new React Native that came out, I don't know, in the last week, had a iOS tool that is not Xcode, so we might check that out. But I think the issues that come up in native are not language centric, more about tooling centric. I do think that, this app would have taken longer to build if it was 5 people as opposed to 1 or 2. I think, sometimes when you're starting out a project, especially until you get the paradigms in place and things like that, it's more than diminishing returns as the team grows. I think it's, counterproductive. It's good to get the right stuff in place before you grow that team.
Yeah, interesting. Going back to the native to React Native transition, Did you end up keeping any of the native code, or have you used the React Native bridge anywhere, or did you just rewrite it completely in, JavaScript or React?
There's a few libraries that we use that we probably reuse some of the code. One of them is a chat program that Zendesk makes called Zopum. And it's a really interesting, it shows how native React Native can be. This thing, it's an SDK you include, and they tap on a screen, and it's a whole UI thing. And so we did the UI bridge sort of thing. And then they start chatting. And then you can go somewhere else in the app, and there's this circle sort of hovering in the lower left-hand corner of your chat, and you can tap on that and bring it back the full screen, sort of in a lot of websites, it's in the lower right-hand corner or something like that. And if you really think about it, this native UI component is overlaid on this crazy React Native diff shadow DOM thing. It's nuts. And it all just worked seamlessly. Some of the other things that, it was mostly around how we started up the app. And I definitely copied over the code on how we do crash reporting and app distribution and other things like that. But for the most part, all new JS code.
I was just going to say, it's really interesting to hear that you didn't actually find much that you needed native for when it comes to rebuilding an app.
Yeah, I mean, if we were only going to make an iOS app, then maybe there would have been something we'd reuse. I can't quite say, but we wanted to do the Android one too, so we saw that as an investment, everything that could be shared.
I've got one for you. So you devoted all this time up front to put out a prototype, but let's say it didn't work out. React Native just maybe wasn't ready for a production grade app.
Sure.
How would you have handled that, right? Would you kind of go back to it a few months later? What would you do, especially if you do sort of believe in the library?
That's interesting. You believe in the roadmap and the promise, but it's just not quite there yet.
Especially, you kind of sold your employees on it, but you haven't gotten there yet.
I think that's one of the tricks. I didn't sell anyone until I was sure.
Ah, okay.
So that prototype was my, more or less my own business until I got more and more sure that it was going to work. Just as the distraction to the greater team. So if it didn't work out, I spent a month on it. Built something and it showed promise, but it wasn't going to work. I think promise of that payout is really high. So I probably would have checked back every few months and saw if understood what my core blockers were. Maybe made some bugs on GitHub or whatever else to try to understand how to get past them, and check back every few months to see if I could overcome them.
Yeah, it's so tough with, new libraries like this. I still consider React Native pretty new, and especially when you're trying to introduce something like that into a company or a business, I almost think that is harder than learning the paradigm, just because everyone's sort of on a different page, and you've got people who are dedicated to iOS and Android, and just kind of getting them to realize this is something really cool and there's so much potential. I feel like that is a pretty hard part.
Yeah, I mean, that's just organizational behavior stuff. And, my best recommendation there is definitely not to in that case, rewrite half the app and show them how much smarter you are than they are. Which is a really tempting technique, right? I see your account section, check out mine, and you can't tell the difference. That might be one proof point, but it's definitely to have them in as part of, that conversation and get buy-in as you're moving forward to make it production ready.
Yeah, absolutely.
So is there anything that you would kind of do differently after being someone that kind of just started from scratch and built an entire app, and now you're done and you kind of know the framework a little better? Is there any maybe tips or anything that you have for anyone kind of starting off?
I mean, I think the biggest tip, is it too much ego to say that we just nailed it? It seems likely to say that. I think, but the biggest tip is understanding what holds the app together. Whether it's how we did routing or not, I think in order to start a project and feel really good about it, you need to sort of build the bones of it and then start hanging stuff off of it. And the URL paradigm that we used was just really great for us. I think tackle those hard things first. And, if you're super just starting out and you've never built any app before, like, you get more value from just seeing, like, oh my gosh, I can actually type something and it changes something on a real app. Like, that's the thrill. But if you've built apps before and, you're looking to build a new app, I think it's just really important to try to understand what's important in your domain space and nail down the scaffolding that's going to make you successful there. And for us, it was that URL routing. Looking back, what would I change? I don't know, man. I just love this thing. I'm sure there's something. I definitely wish the Android was all the way up to speed, but like, I can't complain that much about that. Maybe Windows Phone support. No, I'm just joking about that.
I've got a fun one for you, though. Where do you think, and this is like no right or wrong answers, what do you think the future of React Native is? Like, where do you think it's going to be 2 years from now, if you could guess?
Well, I think there's certainly two dimensions that it could improve, right? One is platform support. I've seen there's a React Native desktop fork or something. There's no particular reason you couldn't write native iOS apps. OS X apps or Windows apps or something like that on this. It's not that different than a project I worked on long ago at IBM called SWT, which is you write Java code and it used the native widgets of the thing. And that was sort of the same powerful concept. Phone apps, all those things. So platform support. I've been on a thread about Apple TV. I'm really a big fan of the Apple TV too, and I was looking into how to do that with React Native. And the other is just better and better development environments and ecosystem and things like that. And like, I don't think we've scratched the surface with like how effective the deploy situation is with these applications. As an example, we see a couple companies and open source libraries and things like that about how to hot deploy, so to speak, these applications. I can only imagine that's going to get better and better and really bring a lot of the ergonomics of this development closer to the web. But without that uncanny valley situation and some of the other issues that we've had in the past with that.
I did want to ask, are you guys taking advantage of hot deploying any of the JavaScript that you have into the Tasker app?
We're currently not. My goal is to get both the apps shipped first and then tackle that, because we're not going to rapidly iterate on anything until we sort of reach parity on both of them. But then, I don't see anything stopping us from, daily deploys like we do on the website, which is like, I don't know, transformational.
That is a really cool idea. Just saying that, about apps.
Yeah, totally.
So we're probably going to wrap it up here in a second. Does anyone have anything else they want to talk about that we haven't really covered? Okay, so I guess we'll go ahead and jump into the picks. Peter, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. So my pick this week is a little different. My VP of engineering, Mike Cruz, sent me this awesome video the other day called How to Be Successful in Life. It's just a short video of Jack Ma basically running down like what your life, if you were to follow a framework for life, like between your 20s and your 30s, 40s and your 50s, etc., just things that you may want to focus on, to get there, and just some pretty good like life stories. It's definitely worth checking out.
Cool. Yeah, we'll link to it. So it's a YouTube video, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Kevin?
Yeah, I've got 3 picks, but all are related to GraphQL. So the first pick is GraphQL. I've been playing with it quite a bit, and it's kind of, it's amazing how you can take data from multiple systems and have them in a shape that you want at that particular moment, and assembled exactly the way you want, nested or literally just the data you want. And I don't know, it's just amazing stuff. So I feel like the last few weeks, all I've said is the word GraphQL. But related to that, two resources, learngraphql.com, which is a resource I've shared with a number of colleagues and friends. The other is an app that was written by Adam Miskowitz, who was on a couple of episodes ago, called Graphical App. And I'll have links to that in the show notes. But it basically is an Electron wrapper around Graphical, which is the GraphQL query interface written in React components. So it makes working with GraphQL a little bit better, even though it's not a big deal with curl. But they have some nice things in the app that include tabs and then just other little nice bits that are in there that you can take advantage of. So I'll have links to those in the show notes.
Awesome. Have you looked at Reindex?
I have. I saw it was the first database, or the GraphQL as a service. It looks pretty intriguing, but I'm still kind of digging into how to get it all set up. So, has anyone else here had a look at that?
I'm hoping to have some time set aside to dig into that. So, okay. Well, my pick is an Egghead series on Cycle.js fundamentals. It's been out for a few weeks now. But the person that put the course out, Andre Stoltz, is going to be joining us in a few weeks. We're looking forward to that. But I've only done a few of the courses so far, but it's pretty interesting stuff, and it kind of gives you a quick introduction to Cycle.js. Brian, do you have any picks?
Yeah, I'm going to use a classic trick, and it's like you get a wish, and my wish is for 3 more wishes or something like that. But I've gotten a lot of value out of the React Native newsletter put on by Brent Batney. Everyone should subscribe to that if you're interested in React Native. Lots of good stuff coming out every week.
Awesome. Yeah, +1 on the React Native newsletter.
Absolutely.
Okay, Brian, well, thank you so much for joining us. We really enjoyed having you on our show today.
Awesome. Pleasure being had.
Okay, well, that wraps up episode 17 of React Native Radio. We'll see everyone next week.